wow, so in places you actually get fined if you don't participate. So they actually force you to vote. So then you think about that. Then there's places like Italy that you get a week to vote. So then you think about, wow, so here we get one day, it's on a Tuesday, and I gotta work on a Tuesday. And then you think about the actual cost it takes. There's, as a rational choice, they were saying, if one voter votes, it's not even worth his time because of the little bit of impact that'll have, but then it takes to get off work, to drive up to the booth, to stand in the line. There's a lot of little things that can deter people from voting and actually politically participating. So when we think about like restrictions, we definitely gotta think about the variety of ways in which this plays in our entire political system. But it was always predicated off of race, definitely.
Mr. Lloyd or Mr. Stevenson, comment?
Yeah, there are a lot of things. I think Oregon just went to opt out. You're automatically registered unless you affirmatively opt out of voter registration. Let me just say this from a quote unquote conservative standpoint, though, and I don't believe a lot of these measures are pushed by true conservatives. Tea Party is not conservative. Okay, let's put that on the table for whatever trouble I'm going to get into about that.
You're being recorded.
I know. It wouldn't be the first time I get in trouble with something. You know, if you look at it from a conservative standpoint, this whole apparatus of how we register to vote and how we approach voting is inefficient. Is way overly costly. If you were to approach it from a true conservative standpoint, you would simplify this. You would make it easier for citizens to be put into some sort of registration system because we waste a lot of money on this apparatus. Representative Neal's been through a lot of the redistricting battles, and I know the work that Dr. White is actually doing is important in that context. I as a lawyer and somebody who's done some of those cases in the past, it doesn't really bother me as much about the Supreme Court's ruling on, which was actually validated Section 4, which essentially made Section 5 moot. The problem is on Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. A lot of these issues can be challenged if the court were to go back and readdress some of the standards that have been imposed historically on Section 2. That's why the work that Paul White was just talking about is vastly and vitally important in those types of battles. So, you know, the way I would look at it is hopefully DOJ or private litigants like the ACLU Voting Rights Project and just individual citizens who have the wherewithal to engage in that type of litigation would start to, once again, address Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act.
Mr. Stevenson.
Well, I'm self-identified as a conservative. I realize and have realized over the years that words can have multiple meanings to different folks. A good definition for me has been to look at the past, discern where we went wrong in the past, and try not to make those same mistakes in the future. That's over against what, you know, again, I don't want to get into classic liberalism or whatever, but it typically happens in, well, kids like, you know, my kids' age and college age and in their 20s who think they don't have to worry about anything that's ever happened. They've got an idea and they're going to make it happen no matter what. You know, there's just a kind of over optimistic view of what you can actually do, and you don't pay attention to the past and try to learn from it. So that's a view of conservatism that I take as being positive. But I do realize, especially in the African American community, that for many it meant water cannons and jail time and lots of other things that they just associate with it. So I think that it's been said, and I think Dr. White said it pretty well, is that, you know, we're in a two-party system and people are on one side or the other, and their identity is as a Republican or as a Democrat or as a conservative or liberal, and there's so much mix within that, we pick what groups we're a part of. What has impacted me the most, I grew up in Rock Hill, went to school in Spartanburg. I left for a while, moved back to Columbia and lived in Columbia. I came back as an evangelical Christian. I grew up Episcopalian, I'd gone to a Methodist school, and I'd kind of been a typical Southern Christian, you know, just culturally. But I came back and through a certain number of circumstances, I realized that what I really wanted to identify was that way. And then if I'm honest about what I believe, then I believe I'm going to live forever in eternity. And I believe anybody else that believes like I believe is going to live in eternity. That includes black folks. So why in the world, if we're going to live together forever, can we not get along on this end? So I think a lot of these recent days, and I mean, I think it's a very eloquent exposition of the problem with, you know, voter ID. I mean, I'm sure Alec and some other people, I mean, Republicans are always, and somebody's always gunning to try to figure out how to win. I mean, that's the whole game. And they may not be conservative. They're just, you know, that's their business, is to try to win. And so when you have this paradigm where you're competing as Republicans and Democrats, you get somebody like Tim Scott who's more conservative than Lindsey Graham from a classical standpoint. But I think you end up with, you got to have a new kind of paradigm. I think that one reason we're having these forums, one reason that we're having lots of conversations across South Carolina was the reaction of the family members of the Emmanuel Nine and Grace, which is a particularly Christian, you know, concept in religion. And it was shocking to a lot of people, and especially a lot of white evangelicals in South Carolina. And I would posit the reason that moved so quickly to take the flag down, because it was the most visible symbol of the past oppression and the taking of symbols and using them in hateful ways, and it was something that could be done to show, I really don't hate you. If this is a symbol of hate, I want to take it out and get it out of here. So now we're talking about political issues. And I think we got to take another tack again. I think we got to say, all right, here's the Democratic issues. I just read an article this morning, and some people are saying, well, now that, you know, we got the Republicans or the conservatives doing what we want them to do, now we want to take all these kind of liberal things that we've been fighting for and deal with it, whatever it might be, whether it's voter ID or anything else. And I think what we got to do is sit back, and I think the one place as Christians, white or black, Hispanic, Asian, whoever, and this doesn't, I mean, if you act in that way that they did in Charleston, then atheists in our society or agnostics or anybody or other religious groups should not fear Christians if they are acting in that manner of goodwill and love towards their neighbor. So I believe in politics, and where we need to move forward to is, I think, issues of poverty. I think, you know, in racial situations in South Carolina, I mean, there's a lot of poor whites and a lot of poor blacks, but there's a higher percentage and a more difficult process for getting out of that poverty in the black community and the white community. And as a Christian, I would want to say to people, so look, man, this is what the Bible from the Old Testament to the New Testament says. What are you doing for the poor and needy? You know, are you taking care of the widow and orphan? You know, are you pursuing justice? Okay, I mean, there's, you know, you guys know better than anybody than justice that's been shown. So if you kind of back up and say, all right, I'm going to start all over again and say, how do we deal, Representative Neal, with issues of poverty in South Carolina, white or black, in goodwill? And that's what I think the discussion has become about. And again, not in a kind of tell you what you do, moral police kind of Christian way, but in a, I'm bad, you're bad, how do we work together to make things as good as we can? So to me, these issues now of depth, you know, I think it was the right decision for the court to rule against, you know, the voter ID law as it was set. At the same time, I'm like a number of people going, I can't get in the hospital without an ID, you know, so there's I understand that it's been used in a way to suppress voting, but I would like to see us, well, let's get everybody registered and work together anyway and try to create a true community of South Carolinians that can trust each other and that look at things with a different paradigm than the way we've looked at them in the past.
Okay.
Can I just add
Yes,
something
please
Alex
do.
said? I don't know, I mean, you know who Michael Steele is, former lieutenant governor, Maryland and former RNC chair, national chair. In talking about North Carolina's efforts on that same front, said it's ridiculous. It's damaging to the Republican Party. What is interesting to me, and it's something that Paul said earlier about his study and as it relates to Tim and others, and I've noticed this sort of on a national scale. I'm not talking about anybody in particular, but black elected conservative politicians generally have to run as far to the right to appeal to the electorate as possible. Quite honestly, most of them could not make the statement that Hal just made. They couldn't make that speech. And what I've always found interesting is when you really look at conservatives like Jack Kemp, somebody who's moderate on a number of issues like a Lindsey Graham, it's very hard around the country to find black elected conservatives who can stake out those positions and get elected. If you move towards that center-right or center of politics, sort of getting back to your original question, the trust factor goes away. So what you end up having is sort of this appeal to as extreme an element in politics as you can. And I think that's something that is a little disturbing. But on a number of fronts, when you get folks like Michael Steele, who are not in elective office, who look at building the Republican Party and trying to make inroads in the minority community, and you look at something like voter ID or some of the other measures, we'll just candidly say that's pardon the language, that's just stupid. I mean, it makes no sense. And so, that level of trust that, here's a different approach, but we're all working for the same goal, is something that I think hopefully at some point conservatives and those on the opposite side of the political spectrum can agree on. Now the methods may be a little different, but the goals ought to be the same. And just what Paul said though, it's a little disturbing to me when you look around nationally at some of the folks whose names I could call, some of the positions they take. And I think it is because they feel they have to appeal to that extreme.
As a political strategist, Mr. Watts, we've heard that a lot of the things that we may think as racist is not particularly racist. It's maybe not colorblind, but it's about the numbers, getting the numbers. I don't know if you care to share with us some of your strategy, but is that something you would do when you are advising a candidate about election or winning an election?
Well, I always advise people I work with, whether it's a referendum committee, an individual running for office. My goal is to get you in that seat, to get you over that 50+1 mark. Sometimes it's done, and sometimes it's not. Fortunately, my record is about 85% of the time we get it through. I will say this. The thing I love about politics is what's true today will change on you in a heartbeat tomorrow. And there's one thing I do want to kind of go to, and that is we're just watching some of the presidential debates I've seen, especially this last one and more recently in previous cycles. If Ronald Reagan was running today, he would be called more liberal than Hillary Clinton because he supported public education, he supports public transportation, and that's what's really scary to me as a strategist is if there's anything at all, it's always about winning your fight, but also having some sort of decorum and play within the rules. Don't break the rules, and don't get mad because you lost and then try to change the rules. And what I'm going to give you, now granted, there's been historical examples all the way through, from Jim Crow to everything. But I just want to give you three that all of you know, but you maybe didn't realize at the time. In 1998, Jim Hodges defeated David Beasley in a very contentious race. And a very important strategy of that, everybody made mention of the video poker element of things, everybody made mention of the Confederate flag thing, But what really unseated David Beasley was the Democrats worked smarter on getting their core vote out. And what they realized going into 1998, before Hodges was even the nominee, was Democrats do very well at getting their vote out in the 96 and presidential elections, but they don't historically do well in turning their votes out for midterm. So what they did, and I was part of this effort, was we actively looked at those areas where there was significant drop-off from presidential to midterm, and we didn't bring it back up to presidential, but we brought it up to a comfortable level that you saw a two-point bounce for the Democrat in a non-typical year. So what happened later? Next year, the members of the legislature tightened up the requirements of how do you vote absentee. Now you have to send in a request to get your absentee ballot, and then you have to fill that out. So you have to get one more hurdle. Another kind of hurdle, and I can't remember, this was during the MLK holiday debate here, I think. In order to give up a holiday, what did they do? They took away a state holiday for election day. State workers used to get election day off during federal holidays. But in order to give the Martin Luther King Day, they decided they didn't want to take away the Confederate Memorial Day, so they'll just take away election day. No harm until the first Tuesday after the first Monday. And then the third thing, of course, was this voter ID that we talked ad nauseum about. And we know, there are some folks that have bad intentions in drafting this, and there are some folks who buy into that. But I do want to go to one thing that Mr. Stevenson said, and he is right, where maybe we need to start looking more along the lines of poverty. But what's always surprising to me is the rhetoric that you see out there. And there's sharp rhetoric on the Democratic side, just as there is sharp rhetoric on the Republican side. MSNBC to Fox News. But what's always striking to me is the conversations from those poor white households. And you would think that they were protecting the millions that they buried out in their backyard that they don't have. And I just don't understand that disconnect. And what it is, I do believe, is that some of that Reagan language, I'm bringing it full circle here, so bear with me, he had a way of inspiring just like Bill Clinton does. He had a way of talking to a room and making you feel like you're the only one he was talking to. And what he talked about during his presidency was prosperity. And people feel, even if they're not prosperous, that other people are trying to keep them from that. And then that's where you see some of the elements of racism come into play in politics. But to answer your question, Henry, I can only speak for myself. I can't speak for other strategists out there, but I've always been a firm believer in you got to digest the numbers. You've got to figure out where you are, because you know where you want to get to. And we can always draw a roadmap, but it's always respecting the rules. You just don't, add another row and column on the chessboard if you're losing. You got to play within that 8x8 frame.
Representative Neal.
I'm listening with interest. What occurred to me was that if you look at politics, not just in South Carolina, but in this country, it's been reduced to us and them. It's us against them, irregardless of the party. It's us against them. But when you take a closer look at it, historically, the us and them has a racial component, always has. Whether you go back to the Dixiecrats, when Strom Thurmond left the Democratic Party and formed the Dixiecrats, it was a racial component to that, a rejection of the civil rights movement. That continued. Even to the point in the 80s when Lee Atwater, former Columbian, devised a racial strategy for the Republican Party around Willie Horton, scaring conservative white voters to death, saying Willie Horton represents a threat, and it's the kind of threat that Democrats will unleash on society if you elect them. Dukakis was a victim of that. He was wiped out because that process, that approach worked very, very well. But it continues today. It has never ended. Much of that approach has been institutionalized in this country, in our courts, in the laws that we pass. 3 strikes you're out, 2 strikes you're out, a plethora of legislative approaches that ended up incarcerating people in this country of color disproportionately, poor people disproportionately, to the point that America now has more people incarcerated than anywhere else in the world. And all of that is part of an institutional reaction to the politics that drive this country. You know, when we look at something as simple as the criminal justice system here, there are two things that happen to people who encounter the judicial system here. One is you better have money, whether you're black or white, because if you don't, you got a problem. Because if you can't afford to hire an attorney, you're going to be passed on to a public defender who does not have the resources, the staff, to adequately defend you. They can't do any research for you. They can't do any expert witnesses for you. They can't do an investigation for you. They don't have the money nor the staff. They're facing a prosecutor who has more than enough resources, because we in the legislature make sure they have more than enough resources. And they're also able to pull private foundation money to a point that we in the legislature can't even quantify how much that is. We've been trying to find out for years. Haven't been able to do that yet. But my point is, it's an uneven playing field. And what we end up with is a situation where that institution ends up being predatory for people of color and poor people. That same approach can be seen at other institutions in this country and in this state. When we talk about employment, when we talk about business, when we talk about opportunities, you know, those same tendencies rear their heads. Let me give an example. We talk about black businesses in South Carolina, and I think you had a forum on that. Well, when you pull the data on what black businesses are able to do, and just doing business with the state of South Carolina, less than 1% of the business contracts that are issued by the state of South Carolina go to black businesses. Less than 1%. Let's take DOT. Those are federal and state dollars. Less than 1%. How does that happen? Well, when we look at how it happens, you find out that there are processes that are developed within those institutions that disadvantage people of color. For example, at DOT. DOT developed a formula to determine how much business black businesses can do with DOT. Here's the kicker. The formula was based on how much work the minority firm had done with the agency the year before. They didn't do any business with the agency the year before because of the formula. Okay, so which meant it perpetuated and projected into the future past discrimination.